know that, but this is take 2. Let's talk about the special senses. Special senses are senses that are housed within the head. They are not typical modified nerve that we have in the general senses. These are specialized receptors, and they cover things like vision, taste, smell, hearing, and equilibrium. They all use special sensory receptors, which is why we call them special senses, and they are all, again, localized within the head region. And they're not just modified nerve endings of the general receptors that we had for things like touch. About 70% of our body's sensory receptors are located within the eye, and about half of our cerebral cortex is involved in visual processing. It takes a lot to learn to see. It's our most learning intense sense. The eye itself is a small sphere, and we can only see about 1/6 of it from the outside. Most of it's enclosed and protected by fat cushions and housed within the bony orbit itself of the skull, but it also has accessory structures along with the eyeball itself. Looking at those accessory structures, we can see the eyebrow, the eyelid, the eyelashes, the iris, the eyelid. Actually, the iris is part of the eye, sorry. Lacrimal caruncle and the medial commissure, which we'll go into in more detail now. So the accessory structures are there to protect and aid the eye in its functioning. They would include the eyebrows, the eyelids, the conjunctiva, the lacrimal apparatus, and the extrinsic eye muscles. Eyebrow overlies the supraorbital margin, and its function is to shade the eye from sunlight and prevent perspiration from reaching the eye. The eyelids are also known as papillae. They are thin, skin-covered folds that protect the eye anteriorly. They're separated at the papillobural fissure, which is the slit, and they meet in the corners at the medial and lateral commissures. We also find the lacrimal caruncle at the medial commissure. It has oil and sweat glands. And the tarsal plates are supporting connective tissue for folds, as well as anchors for the orbicularis oculi muscle and the levator palpebrae superioris muscle. Eyelids blink reflexively every 3 to 7 seconds, and this offers protection from foreign objects and helps spread secretions to moisten the eye. The eyelashes have follicles that are innervated, and those nerve endings initiate reflexive blinking if anything gets close to our eye. There are glands that lubricate the eye, including the tarsal or meibomian glands, which is a modified sebaceous gland producing an oily secretion that lubricates the lid and the eye. And in addition to that are the ciliary glands between hair follicles that are modified sweat glands. And those are all shown in figure 15.1b. The conjunctiva is a transparent mucous membrane that produces a lubricating mucus secretion. We have the papillobra conjunctiva, which is a membrane that lines the underside of the eyelid. The bulbar conjunctiva, which covers the white of the eyes, not the cornea. It contains small blood vessels found in this membrane. This is what we see those blood vessels when someone has bloodshot eyes. The conjunctival sac is the space between the papillobural and bulbar conjunctiva. It's the area where we would put our contact lenses. The lacrimal apparatus consists of the lacrimal gland and ducts, drains into the nasal cavity. The lacrimal gland itself is located in orbit above the lateral end of the eye and secretes lacrimal secretions, which we typically refer to as tears. And again, those tears are a dilute saline solution with mucus, antibodies, and the enzyme lysozyme. As we blink, the tears are moved towards the medial commissure, and there they enter the paired lacrimal caniculi and the lacrimal punctua. From there, the tears would drain into the lacrimal sac and into the nasolacrimal duct, which empties into the nasal cavity. So when you express tears, your nose also runs. And that pathway is shown here. Yeah. The other accessory structures of the eye would include the extrinsic eye muscles, which are 6 strap-like muscles that originate on the bony orbit and insert onto the eyeball. These muscles allow the eye to follow moving objects. They help to maintain the shape of the eyeball and hold it in the orbit. There are 4 rectus muscles that originate from a common tenendus ring, and their name indicates the movement they allow. So we have the superior rectus, inferior rectus, lateral rectus, and medial rectus. There are also 2 oblique muscles that move the eye in the vertical plane and rotate the eye at an angle. So these would be the superior and the inferior oblique muscles. And a number of those are shown here. I guess all 6 of them are. Superior, the tendon at least, rectus, oblique tendon, the oblique muscle, the superior rectus, lateral rectus, and this is the movement that they allow. Calazion is an obstructed tarsal gland that can result in a firm, usually painless bump, whereas a stye is a painful inflammation of any one of the sebaceous glands at the base of an eyelash. Conjunctivitis is inflammation of that conjunctiva that gives a reddened, irritated eye. And pink eye is a conjunctival infection or conjunctivitis that's caused by an infectious agent, bacteria or virus, and pink eye tends to be highly contagious. Nasal cavity mucosa, again, is continuous with the mucosa of the lacrimal duct system. So a cold or nasal inflammation often causes lacrimal mucosa to swell. That swelling can constrict the ducts and prevent tears from draining, which would lead to what we often refer to as watery eyes. Diplopia, or double vision, as I like to say, occurs when the movements of the external muscles are not perfectly coordinated, so a person cannot properly focus the images on the same area of the visual field from each eye, so you get 2 images instead of 1. That can be a result of paralysis, it can be the result of extrinsic muscle weakness, or it could be indicative of a neurological disorder. Strabismus, or cross-eyed, is a congenital weakness of the external eye muscles. The eyes rotate medially or laterally, so the eyes alternate focusing on objects, or only a controllable eye is used. Then the brain begins to disregard input from the deviant eye, and that can become functionally blind if not treated early. So the eyeball itself is made up of 3 layers. The internal cavity is, I'm going to stop there first. Contains 3 layers, a fibrous outer layer, a vascular layer, and an inner layer. The internal cavities are filled with fluids. Those fluids, like many fluids in the body, are called humors. And the lens itself is going to separate that into an internal cavity, and separates the internal cavity into 2 cavities, the anterior and posterior portions. Anterior, posterior. The fibrous layer is the outermost layer. It's a dense avascular connective tissue divided into the sclera and the cornea. The sclera is opaque. The posterior portion protects and shapes the eyeball, helps to anchor the extrinsic eye muscles, and posteriorly, where the optic nerve exits the eye, the sclera is continuous with the dura mater of the brain. The cornea, on the other hand, is transparent. It's the anterior, about 1/6 of the fibrous layer. Forms the clear window that lets light enter and bends light as it enters the eye. The epithelium covers both surfaces. The outer surface protects from abrasions. The inner layer, the corneal endothelium, contains sodium pumps, and those help to maintain the clarity of the cornea. We'll talk about those when we talk about the homeostatic imbalances. There are also numerous pain receptors that contribute to blinking and tearing reflexes. The middle layer is the vascular layer. It's also called the uvea. It's divided into the choroid, the ciliary body, and the iris. The choroid region is the furthest back. It supplies blood to all the layers of the eyeball. It's got a brown pigment that helps to absorb light and helps prevent scattering of light, which would cause difficulty in the nerves reading visual input. The ciliary body is anterior. Its thickened ring of tissue surrounding the lens itself consists of smooth muscle bundles, the ciliary muscles that control the shape of the lens, and the capillaries of the ciliary process secrete fluid for the anterior segment of the eyeball. The ciliary zonule, also referred to as the suspensory ligament, extends from the ciliary process to the lens, and that holds the lens in position. The iris is the colored part of the eye that lies between the cornea and the lens. It's continuous with the ciliary body. The pupil is the actual central opening that regulates the amount of light that gets into the eye. So for close vision and bright light, the sphincter muscles, which are circular muscles, contract and the pupil constricts. That is under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system. For distant vision and dim lights, the dilator pupillae, which are radial muscles, contract and the pupils dilate. That's under sympathetic nervous system control. And so therefore changes in emotional state can also happen when you stimulate parasympathetic or sympathetic. So your pupils might tend to dilate when the subject matter is appealing or if you are deep in a problem-solving skill. The inner layer, also referred to as the retina, it is actually an outpocketing of the brain. Your eyes really are an extension of your brain. They contain millions of photoreceptor cells that transduce light energy. They are like the central nervous system, neurons and glial cells. It's a delicate two-layered membrane. The outer layer is the pigmented layer. The inner layer is where the neurons are found. The pigmented layer of the retina is a single cell thick lining next to the choroid. It extends anteriorly, covering the ciliary body and the iris. Its function is to absorb light and prevent scattering. It also phagocytizes the photoreceptors of cell fragments, which we'll talk about when we're talking about signal transduction. And it's a location where we can store vitamin A, which is important in those photoreceptor processes. The neural layer of the retina is a transparent layer that runs anteriorly to the margin of the ciliary body. Its anterior end has serrated edges called the ora serrata, composed of three main types of neurons: the photoreceptors, bipolar cells, and ganglion cells. Light is going to activate photoreceptors, which will communicate with bipolar cells, and those bipolar cells are connected to other groups of cells called ganglion cells, and then that is sent back through the optic nerve to the brain for processing. The optic disc is the place where the optic nerve leaves the eye. There are no photoreceptors in the optic disc, so it is often referred to as the blind spot. The retina itself has 250 million photoreceptors that are either rods or cones. The rods work in dim light. They are found around the periphery of our retina. They are more numerous and they are more sensitive to light than cones, but they do not provide for color vision. They don't provide for sharp edges, sharp images. The cones, on the other hand, are the vision receptors for bright light. We get high resolution color vision because of the cones. The macula lutea are the areas of the posterior pole just to the side of the blind spot, which is mostly cones. And within that macula lutea is the fovea centralis, which is just cones, no rods, and this is where we get our best visual acuity. And this is where, when we talk about light focusing on the retina, we want light to be focused as much as possible on the fovea centralis, get our clearest vision. So here is our outer layer, pigmented layer of the retina. Light comes in, strikes the rods or cones, goes to the bipolar cells, which connect to different ganglia. And this is what it looks like under the microscope. So there are two sources of blood supply to the retina. The choroid supplies the outer third, the part that has the photoreceptors, and the central artery and vein of the retina supply the inner two-thirds that enter and exit the eye in the center of the optic nerve. And those vessels are visible in a living person. You may have had an image taken when you went to an optometrist and saw such as this. So retinal detachment is a condition where the pigmented and neural layers separate or detach from each other. That allows the jelly-like vitreous humor to get between them, and if not treated quickly, that can lead to permanent blindness. It generally happens when the retina is torn during a traumatic blow or the head, to the head, or when you get a sudden stop of head movement, so a car accident, bungee jumping, and sometimes in some people it just happens. So need to treat that. Symptoms described by patients as a curtain being drawn across the eye or soot-like spots or light flashes. That retina can be reattached with laser surgery. They can also do some other things to try to push the retina back to where it belongs. The chambers and fluids, so the lens and the ciliary zonule separate the eye into two segments, the posterior segment and the anterior segment. The posterior segment contains vitreous humor, that fluid that transmits light, supports the posterior surface of the lens, holds the neural layer of the retina firmly against the pigmented layer, and it contributes to intraocular pressure. Vitreous humor is formed as we are embryos, and that vitreous humor is the same vitreous humor that we keep for our lifetime. In the anterior segment, the iris divides the anterior segment into two chambers, an anterior chamber and a posterior chamber. So the anterior chamber is between the cornea and the iris. The posterior chamber is between the iris and the lens. Each one of those segments contains aqueous humor, which is a plasma-like fluid that is continuously formed, so it's not the same as vitreous humor, by capillaries of the ciliary process. That drains through the scleral venous sinus, which has traditionally been known as the canal of Schlemm, into the scleral cornea junction. And that supplies nutrients and oxygen to the lens and the cornea, as well as the retina, and helps get rid of waste. So this will walk you through the steps of that circulation. Glaucoma is a condition in which the drainage of the aqueous humor is blocked and the fluid backs up, increasing the pressure within the eye. That pressure may increase to dangerous levels and compress the retina and the optic nerve, which can lead to blindness. Unfortunately, there are very few early signs of glaucoma, and as it continues, though, start to see halos and lights and round lights and blurred vision. It's very important to get this detected as soon as possible. So we do intraocular pressures by putting a puff of air into your cornea and measuring the amount of corneal deformation. should have that done annually by an optometrist. If you have glasses, you probably do. If you don't have glasses, you should still be screened for glaucoma. There are eye drops that can increase the rate of aqueous humor drainage or decrease its production. And then there's also laser therapy or surgeries that can be used to treat glaucoma. The lens is a biconvex, transparent, flexible, and avascular. It changes shape to precisely focus the light on the retina. There are two regions of the lens epithelium, which is the anterior region, and these cells are cuboidal cells that differentiate into lens fiber cells. And lens fibers form the bulk of the lens, and they are filled with a transparent protein called crystalline. The lens fibers are continuously added, so the lens becomes more dense, convex, and less elastic as we get older. Imbalances here would include clouding of the lens, which is a consequence of aging, exacerbated by things such as diabetes mellitus, heavy smoking, or frequent exposure to intense sunlight. Sometimes it's congenital. The crystalline proteins can clump, clouding the lens. Vitamin C increases cataract formation, excessive vitamin C. But lenses can be replaced surgically with artificial lenses. So here is a picture of a cataract, that cloudiness of the lens, and nothing to do with a bright dot. It's more of the looking here. All right, that should end the first part.